Hello again. Sorry it's been such a long time since I made a video last. I've just been very busy, and although I actually had the script for this video written ages ago, I just didn't get around to recording it. I can't say that I will start making regular videos again. I'm just very busy at the moment. I've got some other projects on the go, but I am hoping that I can maybe get back into the swing of things and start making more regular videos again. But we will see how we go. In any case, I wanted to do a video that is a sequel to a video that I made a while ago now on 5 storytelling tropes that I dislike in contemporary fiction. And I wanted to do a more positive video focusing on 5 things I want to see more of in storytelling. Now, a slight caveat to this is that I don't read new books that often, so maybe there are lots of books that do these things and I'm just not aware of them. In that case, just take this as me asking for recommendations for books that are contemporary that do these things. But in any case, every book that I have read that's contemporary tends to lack these things, and so these are things that I am hoping will make a comeback, things that I think definitely we need to have more of. First up, we have aspirational heroes. This idea actually came from one of the commenters on the last video that I made. They mentioned actually the importance of having an aspirational hero as opposed to these sort of anti-heroes where they're just terrible people and we sort of revel in how terrible they are. And we had a bit of a discussion about that, and I thought it was a very good point, and it's something that I think you don't get that much of in fiction today. And not just fiction, but films as well. There's always, it's always got to be an anti-hero. It's always got to be someone with deep flaws or whatever. It can't just be someone that you aspire to be like. I was writing a philosophy paper recently on the connection between moral philosophy and aesthetics, and ended up reading a bit of the Marquis de Sade's writings on what he thinks is the purpose of novel writing. And one thing that he mentioned that really struck with me is that he said that the artist should write or create characters or create men not as he is, but as he ought to be, suggesting that, the point of writing books or creating stories is to show people how people can be in different circumstances. Now, obviously, Sade focuses very much on the negative possibilities of human beings rather than the positive ones, but I want to kind of reframe his point now in terms of something more aspirational. The reason why I like aspirational heroes is precisely because they're better than me. I don't want to be comforted in my flaws. I want to look up and be inspired. And I get that when you have a hero that, it's not to say that they're perfect, but that they're able to stand up for their values, right? They're able to do the things that you might be too cowardly to do in your own life. For me, that's something that I really admire, rather than a hero that maybe I can relate to a little bit more, but ultimately they just have the same flaws as me, so I don't feel as inspired when I read those kinds of books. For me, I don't want validation when I read, I want inspiration. It seems like a lot of people who don't like this kind of hero as much in modern fiction, they tend to argue that these types of heroes are sort of unattainable or too perfect. And I think that that's the case in poorly written books, but there are plenty of examples of aspirational heroes that are still down-to-earth, good-hearted people that you can relate to. Think of Aragorn from Lord of the Rings. Yes, he does great things, but he's also a pretty mundane person. He's not atypical, he's not exceptional in any way where you feel like you couldn't attain that. And that's the kind of aspirational hero that I like. Someone who isn't so godly that they're impossible to touch, but someone who, is down-to-earth enough, but ultimately does the good thing in the end. And that doesn't mean that they don't have flaws either, of course. Another argument that people give is that, aspirational heroes are unrealistic. And I think this comes from maybe a comic book mindset, right? So you've got these ideas of superheroes in mind. And superheroes, to be fair, they often are very idealistic, right? It's not to say that they're completely, Mary Sue-like, but they are quite perfect in a way that sometimes makes them not very relatable and a bit intangible. But that doesn't seem to be the main way that heroes get written about, right? There are plenty of examples of reluctant heroes who begin unsure, but ultimately do something for the good. In fact, again, to use Lord of the Rings example, both Bilbo and Frodo fit into this mold. Loads of examples of heroes like that ultimately come into their own and are very aspirational, and they're not these anti-heroes brooding their way through, 400 pages of a novel. Another reason why I like aspirational heroes is that it reflects a more optimistic view of reality in terms of the perspective that the novel has. By having a hero that ultimately overcomes their flaws and becomes a good person, becomes someone that you can admire, it suggests this narrative where people can overcome their flaws, they can do better, and also you can do better, whereas anti-heroes tend to have a more cynical effect. Again, that's not true in every case. I mean, Wuthering Heights, for all of its darkness, has a somewhat optimistic ending, although Heathcliff does have to die for that to happen, so it's hard to say whether the anti-hero there is someone who's being lauded at the end of the story, but still you can have optimism within an anti-hero narrative as well. But I think that the aspirational hero lends it much more to optimism, which is something that I'll talk a little bit more about later on as well. But before we get to that, I want to talk about another thing that I think is underrated, and that is mixed-sex friendships. I've read lots of novels where there are really good bonds between two men or two women, and these are great books. But you know, it's harder to get a book where you have a man and a woman, because there's always that tendency for the writer or the creator to just push those two people together. I remember years and years ago I used to watch the TV series Bones, and the two main characters in that had a really good and interesting relationship as friends. At some point I stopped watching the show, but my sister carried on watching it, and she told me that at some point they get married and they have kids, and I didn't watch the show at that point and still haven't and probably won't. But I just think that probably ruined the dynamic in a lot of ways that they had. And I can see why the show creators did that, because there always was that impulse there. There always is that tension there, because generally speaking, most people are straight. So if there are two straight friends, male or female, they might go together. But that's not always the case, right? And so I think it's nice when you get a story that doesn't go that way, and you end up with a very deep friendship between a man and a woman. And again, it's just something that you don't see very often. And even if they don't hook up in the end, there is always that temptation to have a will they, won't they storyline, just because it's a man and a woman, I guess. But I just think it'd be nice to maybe resist that impulse once in a while and go down the friendship route and see where we go. That being said, in the book that I'm writing at the minute, I really don't follow my own advice here, so guilty as charged. But still, I think that it would be nice for more novels to focus on that kind of relationship, because I don't think enough do. I think there's a lot that you could mine within that. The third thing is dialing back a little bit, back to that point that I made about optimism. And I would like to see more optimism in novels. And I'm going to use the example of Dickens here, because I think when you say optimism, it makes it sound like you just want these happy novels where everything's lovely and everything's like bright and sunny, and it's completely unrealistic and silly, just in the way that novels that are obsessively dark come across as unrealistic as well. And that's not quite what I mean. Dickens, in my view, is a very optimistic novelist, but his novels are actually very dark. They're very bleak. There's death, there's chaos, there's all kinds of horrible things, corruption in the law, people being abused, people living terrible lives. But what makes Dickens such a compelling writer to me is that throughout all of this misery, throughout all of that suffering, there's this spirit, the spirit of Dickens, that comes through and fills every scene with comedy and shades of light, so that even in the darkest moments you don't feel complete despair. Maybe a couple of moments when you do, because he can be quite a scary writer at times. But generally speaking, there is this optimism throughout Dickens that I really appreciate, despite the darkness in his book. And that's what I mean by optimism here. I don't mean happy-go-lucky per se. I just mean this kind of spirit, this life-affirming spirit that I find in Dickens. And to compare Dickens to Donna Tartt, who is a modern novelist who I really enjoy, so I'm not criticising her work. But one thing that I will say is that her work is often described as Dickensian, and it certainly is, but it's Dickensian with that optimism stripped out. There's nothing optimistic, really, about Tartt's novels. Maybe the end of The Little Friend, because it's somewhat ambiguous, but even that, it's very bleak, it's very dark, and there really isn't much light at the end of the tunnel in most of her books. She tends to leave her characters pretty broken down, somewhat ambiguously, but still. It's quite miserable. And I enjoy her books. I think she's a fantastic writer. But it's an example of how in modern literature there's always this tendency to just be really miserable about everything. And I don't think you need to. I think you can still be dark and gritty, as Dickens was, and still have that optimism, that life-affirming quality, which is just something that I think I appreciate and just I don't see enough of. And given how bleak people tend to be these days, I think just novels that have a little bit more of that character to them would certainly be welcome. Now I'm going to go a little bit darker again and say that for the next thing, I want some evil villains. And what I mean by that is villains that are just unapologetically bad. And that doesn't mean that they have to be one note per se. It just means that I just am so sick to death. And this came out in the video that I did about tropes that I don't like. I'm sick to death of redemption storylines for villains, or these backstories where it's all about how they were abused and they're sort of good underneath it all. I just despair with that to some extent, because I do genuinely think that there are some people in the world that are just downright evil, even if they've had a bad past. I think that those people are just bad. Serial killers would be an example, warmongers, etc. And I think I just want to see more of that. Also because I find that those kinds of villains tend to be more entertaining than the sort of brooding, despairing villain that just wants people to cry about their sobby backstory. Like, not interested in that. Give me a mustache-twirling villain who has a great wit, who's dark, who revels in it. I really enjoy that. And that's not to say that they really have to be so much of a stereotype. I mean, I did say mustache twizzling, but still, just someone with a bit of flair as a villain, someone who's just dark and revels in that. I want to see a little bit more of that. That doesn't mean that they have to be one note per se. They can still have interesting reasons for being evil, for example. Just don't make it all about some sad, wishy-washy backstory, because it's tedious, and to be honest, at this point, it just feels like lazy writing, right? It's a very easy trope. Villain had a tragic backstory that led up to this moment. Fair enough, it happens, but if that's just your go-to for a villain, at this point, it's just not very imaginative. Whereas maybe going back to just evil villain with some interesting motivation, perhaps, might actually be just a better way to go. I certainly find, in general, those villains to be way more entertaining to read, so I want to see a little bit more of that. That being said, one thing that I do want to make a distinction with here is a distinction between sort of a compelling villain that's unapologetically bad and a villain that's basically just a stand-in for someone's political enemy, right? So if you have a book that's quite political, and they dislike a certain class of people, and so they just make all of their villains that type of person, and the reason why they're bad is just because they're that type of person. That's not interesting either, right? So I'm not saying go down that route. I'm saying do something interesting, but also just do something dark. Don't try and have them redeemed. Don't try and have them have this moment where they cry about how sad their upbringing was. Just avoid those tropes. Go for something dark, but still keep it interesting. That's the kind of thing that I'm pushing here. The last thing I want to talk about is slightly abstract, and I'm not even sure this is the right word to describe what I mean here. And it is to do with a comparison, or something that I've noticed anyway, when I read older books and then read newer ones, is, I don't know if this is the right word, but I'll go with it and see what you say in the comments. But it's what I would call sincerity, and I want to see more of that in books. Now, what I don't mean by that is that everyone that writes books today is a sellout. That's not what I mean at all. But what I mean is, every time I read a book, and maybe it's just the last couple of books that I read that were recent. So I read Fraud, and I read Babel, which I've ranted about quite a lot. So I'll try not to do that in this video. But one thing that I find in a lot of in these contemporary books is there's this sort of tone of the author that is, they just come across as sort of above it. They're sort of over it. In a way that I often don't find that to be the case in older books. The only example where I get a little bit of that sometimes is when I read Jane Austen, because she can be quite ironic and silly in that way. But even with her, she has her moments of real sincerity where she lets that side go, so it doesn't bother me as much. But I find that tone generally to be quite consistent. Not so much in fantasy books. The fantasy books that I read, they tend to be quite sincere. And I think that's probably because with a fantasy book, these authors are creating worlds from scratch out of their own imagination, so they deeply care about it in a way that maybe people writing in the real world maybe don't have that as much. It'd be a speculation really to say. I don't know what the difference is, but I do find it more in so-called literary fiction, this ironic, above it all detached tone. And the problem with that, I find, is that it just takes me out of the novel. When I was reading Fraud by Zadie Smith, for example, there were bits that I really enjoyed, but because of the authorial voice, it just constantly removed me from the story, and I was thinking about her, the author, and what she was trying to tell me. Same with Babel, rather than actually investing in the story. Whereas, for example, with Dickens, I mean, it's quite clear that Dickens has a message with his writing, and sometimes he addresses the audience with his narrator. So he does make his presence known sometimes in his books, but he also drags you completely in the story, and he has this deep sincerity, and that sometimes takes him down some embarrassing roads, right? Because he can be quite sentimental and over the top and silly in that way. But I like that. I like, for example, if I was to go to a concert, for example, I'd rather see someone just throwing themselves into it. Maybe they hit a few bum notes because they're throwing themselves into it, but you can see the passion, right? And I want to see that more with writing, or read more, I guess, with writing. And even if that means that sometimes things get a bit silly or over the top or melodramatic, I'd much rather that, right? I mean, Wuthering Heights is a deeply melodramatic book, but Emily Bronte has such sincerity with it and such conviction with it that it doesn't mostly come across as silly and overdone, in a way where I think now people feel ashamed to have that kind of emotion, because it's quite vulnerable, right, to sort of put yourself out there in that way. And so there's this tendency to sort of detach. And I think as well, maybe it's something to do with, especially with literary fiction, it's the sort of academic sort of infestation. You know, people feel like if you're writing a novel, a serious novel, then it has to be sort of serious and it has to be detached in that academic way. And as someone who is an academic and who also writes, skirting that line between those two things is quite hard, just because if you're writing one way all the time and then you're trying to do a different style of writing, it can infect the other. And so that's something that I just like to see more of. Like, as I said, I don't know if sincerity is the right word there, but I guess what I mean is I just want to see more that really serious conviction, a lack of this sort of detached posturing that I read when I read new books. Again, I don't read new books very often. It's perfectly possible that I have just read books that for some reason fit that mold, but actually don't. That actually are sincere. An example of something that I do find quite sincere, actually, that I read somewhat recently, were the V.C. Andrews books. Are they good, well-written books? Absolutely not. I mean, sometimes they are, but generally speaking, the plots are too ridiculous, the writing style is bizarre, but she is sincere, and she's so strange and weird that it just works anyway. And that, to me, means so much more, and I enjoy those books a lot more, say, even than something like Zadie Smith's Fraud. I can see that there's more intellectual merit, maybe, to Fraud. Certainly there is, than V.C. Andrews' books. But there's just something about V.C. Andrews' commitment, sincerity, that just draws you in and allows you to look past some of that stuff. Whereas that detached, ironic tone actually sometimes damages your investment in the book, because although you can appreciate it intellectually, you just don't feel it. And for me, reading is primarily, it's about feelings. It's about not just emotions, but experiencing something in a deep way, not just in the cerebral way. But I think that in a lot of literary fiction, there is that push to be cerebral about everything. So there we are. I mean, as I said, maybe not sincerity, but you get what I mean. I would say passion, but that seems a bit mean. I'm sure Zadie Smith is very passionate about what she does. So I don't think passion is the right word there. But sincerity might be roughly what I'm getting at. Alright, that is it for this video. Let me know in the comments what are 5 things that you want to see more of in storytelling today. Let me know what you think of the things I've said. If I'm just ranting in the wind and I just need to read more modern books, do let me know, and suggest books that you think do this, because I would like to read more contemporary books. I don't hate them, it's just often I don't enjoy them as much. So it'd be interesting to get some suggestions in the comments of books that you think do this. I am reading again at the minute, which is something that I've not been doing, which is another reason why I've not been making videos as religiously as I used to. So hopefully, if I start getting into the reading again, I'll have books to review and have things to say. So we'll see how that goes. Hopefully it won't be a month until I make the next video, though. Take care, everyone. Ta-ra.